I'm joined today by Assemblyman Sauickie, who represents the 12th District. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. So let's jump right into it. One of the issues that you've been very vocal on, it means a lot to your district, is warehouse development. Obviously, the positive side is that it is part of economic development, but it comes with some baggage. You want to talk about that a little bit and your fight around this issue?
I am against warehouses being placed in the wrong place, like good, pristine farmland, for example.
Right.
So the bills that I have really try to help a municipality prepare better. They help educate their land use volunteers, which is a big problem. Most municipalities are just happy to get a volunteer on their land use boards. Rarely do they get anybody that knows anything actually about land use. And then one of the biggest issues that we've seen are municipalities are getting caught off guard where suddenly warehouses are showing up in zones that they never planned for. So a bill, for example, that I have incentivizes a municipality to open their master plan, which is expensive, incentivizes them with some funding to do that, and to use state model ordinances to actually address the issue ahead of it becoming an even bigger problem.
So take a step back there. You mentioned the master plan.
Yeah.
Can you explain what the real intent of a master plan is and what are they?
Yeah, so every municipality has a master plan. They're usually reviewed formally every 10 years. They can be reviewed more often, but again, there's an expense to doing it. It's close to $500,000 every 10 years. If you do a smaller one, it could be a couple of $100,000. The master plan itself is really to guide the municipality and for them to think about where they want to zone specific things. For example, where they want their residential zoning versus their commercial zoning. So if they don't spend the time that they need and do it right, you could end up having things in your municipality that you really don't want, or at least in places you don't want them.
And you've really been on both sides of this as a local elected official and now in the state legislature. So how has that shaped your view and helped you get your head around this whole issue? Yeah,
well, being a councilman in Jackson was a real education. Jackson is the third largest municipality in the state by land, 100.3 square miles. So we have a lot of land. And, there are developers that want to develop that land. We've preserved well over 40% of it. It's what really led me to focus on land preservation and open space in general. What I did find is that more needed to be done at the state level. So in the role that I'm in now, it's an opportunity to address what I've learned at the municipal level. In fact, I was on the zoning board there as well at one point, and really understand what needs to be done with things like affordable housing or what was called COA, as well as other land use items that need to be addressed.
So you talked about a bill that you sponsored. How is it gaining traction? Do you have support? How do you go about, or have you gone about, building a coalition of other legislators who are in the same boat you are and see things the same way? Yeah,
well, despite having certain values that I represent and those that I think the majority of my constituents want me to represent, I do try to reach across the aisle. I think I've, in a very short period of time, gained a reputation of reaching across the aisle. And as a result, even though I'm in the minority, I've had several bills signed into law at this point. A lot of the bills that I have around warehouses are already bipartisan. So either within the Assembly, I have members on the other side of the aisle who have signed on to those bills, or in some cases, the Senate version was sent in by a member of the other side of the aisle, making it bipartisan across the Assembly and the Senate.
Well, congratulations on that. A kind of a rare feat these days in our legislature. So it's great when you can hear about common ground that really does help your constituents and the residents of New Jersey, particularly on this issue. Yeah,
this is a common sense issue. I found that it's mostly bipartisan, that no matter what district you represent, who you represent, people want this done right.
Great, so let's switch gears here and talk a little bit about school funding.
Okay.
And I know this is something that's near and dear to your heart, both as a legislator and as a parent.
That's right.
Let's start at the very beginning. S2. People are hearing about it in the news and conversation. What is it?
Yeah, so for anyone tuning in, S2 stands for Senate Version 2, or Senate Bill 2. Senate Bill 2 was sponsored in 2018 by then President Steve Sweeney. It was signed into law by Governor Murphy, and frankly, I think it's doing exactly what they intended it to do. It is siphoning away income tax, which becomes state aid for schools, away from school districts that were otherwise functioning really well, and funneling those resources to mostly urban school districts, the school districts in the cities. For example, the Newark City School District gets about $30,000 per student. The Jackson School District gets about $3,500. Toms River gets about $1,700. So a big disparity between what these school districts are getting in terms of state aid. I think it's important that everyone understands what state aid is. State aid is the proportion of the income tax that you already paid coming back to your school district. So, for example, in the Jackson School District, the Jackson residents paid $68 million in income tax in 2021, which is the last year we have available. Out of that $68 million, they're getting $23 million back for their children in the Jackson School District. The Newark City School District, all the residents in Newark paid $44 million. So Jackson paid $68 million, much smaller town. Newark, in its entirety, paid $44, and they're getting $1.25 billion in state aid. All right.
These are staggering numbers.
Yeah, big difference. Right. And again, the per student numbers are really what should underscore it. When you're talking about $30,000 per student in one district and less than $2,000 in another, that's a big disparity. And the problem is throwing money at it isn't solving the problem. The results in that district show that 90% of third graders through eighth graders can't read at their respective grade level. So throwing money at it, and they've been throwing money at it for years now, including an additional $100 million this year alone to that school district, while almost 140 school districts lost the same amount of money.
So we've been looking into this a fair amount, and it's interesting to note the difference in cost per pupil at schools, even within the same district.
Yeah.
There's a disparity between all of the schools in Newark and the cost per pupil, up to about $5,000 per student difference.
Yeah.
Is this something at some point the legislature is going to look into? Like, hey, there's a certain number here where we need to stop and really take a look as to whether or not that is the real cost per student for real education.
Yeah, and I think what you're asking is there a cap in terms of the amount per student? I think there's a limit on both ends. 30,000 plus seems like a lot in one district.
Right.
1,700 in another is probably way too low. I don't think anybody would say, hey, 1,700 in state aid per student is getting it done. I don't think you have to really think about it too much to feel that way. So I do think that you need to look at it at both ends. And yeah, you need to look at the results. And what I've said publicly, nobody wants to see the students in Newark not perform well. They're children, right? It's children in every school district. We want to see them all do really well,
right.
All right? But clearly, throwing more money isn't solving the problem.
And interestingly, the cost per student is not necessarily reflective of the salaries of the teachers in the district.
That's
so
correct.
It's interesting, all the pieces that go into the cost per pupil. So this is not at all an interest in changing any salaries, or this has nothing to do with teachers so much as looking at the entire education system and what it costs, nuts to bolts.
What you're seeing right now from the most recent impacts to state aid cuts in certain school districts, you're now destroying school districts that were really operating well. They created STEM programs, they added AP classes, National Honor Society, multiple honor societies. And suddenly they're now cutting all of their clubs. They're cutting sports teams.
Well, in this day and age where we've really talked a lot about mental health for our students and our youth, it's a little disheartening to hear about cuts to extracurricular activities and how kids are spending their free time.
You're spot on, and especially post-COVID, now is the worst time to be taking funding away from these school districts. And things that don't get talked about are increases in special needs, increases in multi-language learners, right? All of which require smaller class sizes. So anyone who wants to say, well, the funding's gone up, but the enrollment's gone down. And I think the enrollment across that same time period went down about 4% in the entire state. But what they don't talk about is the fact that special needs has gone up, in some cases, triple percentage points. The Toms River School District has seen an increase of 350%. I don't even represent that school district, but they have been hit so hard. And nobody talks about the fact that their special needs went up 300% and their multi-language learners went up almost the same.
That's definitely worth talking about. And actually, we've done a report recently talking exactly about that, how the budget has gone up, but this is at the time of a population decline and declining enrollment in the schools. And actually, according to our research, declining enrollment's about 17% at this point. So it is worth comparing. And we need to make sure, to your point, we need to make sure we're comparing apples to apples on this issue.
That's right.
Because the cost per pupil is also reflected, in the special needs category that is a more expensive category of education.
Yeah, and I think other areas that need to be considered more, things like transportation costs. Every one of us have to pay more for gas, right? The schools aren't immune to that, right? So transportation costs have gone up, labor costs for bus drivers have gone up, right? So the Jackson School District, for example, their total transportation budget is $20 million. They only get $600,000 in state aid. So it's items like that that have to be looked at when you look at the overall formula.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? I know that you were part of a group of legislators who really spoke up about this, and of the 137 school districts that lost funding, you had to do something. Where did you make up the money? What happened next, and what was your response?
Yeah, well, my response has been a couple things. One, I've been trying to educate my fellow legislators. You can't assume that they know what's going on in your legislative district. They represent their own. Right. They may not have the same problems. Although I found that colleagues across the aisle do have similar issues, even though they may be operating across the aisle, they are impacted by this formula and the impacts of the cuts. So I've been speaking publicly on the Assembly floor to make sure that all of my fellow colleagues know what's going on in school districts that I represent and some of the ones around me. So that's been first. Second, I've sponsored numerous bills, including bills that would fully fund the formula this year, including the state cuts that have been impacted to the tune of over $100 million for the 137 districts you mentioned, without adding additional cost or raising taxes. It's been a reallocation of budget money, because there's a lot of stuff in the budget that, frankly, I think is being wastefully spent that could be otherwise spent on more important things like this.
Do you want to dive into that a little bit about this reallocation? I think it's something that people are really interested in, is priorities of spending in Trenton. And there hasn't been a lot of public debate and public conversation about cuts. There's been plenty of conversation about taxes, and I'm happy to get into that as well. But there's not a lot of talk about the cuts.
Yeah, well, I think you'd agree. The state doesn't have a revenue issue. The state has a spending issue. I've only been in office a little more than a year and a half. This is my second budget cycle. I've read each budget line item by line item, which takes a long time. All right. There are things in this budget that are ridiculous. And I'll give you my favorite example. All right. There's the French Art Museum in Jersey City.
I knew you were going to say that one.
And frankly, I feel like I've been talking about that before it was popular to talk about.
The Pompidou?
Right? The Pompidou, right? So the Pompidou last year had $13 million in the budget. There was an extra $24 million put in afterwards. Then $18 million was initially allocated for this year. In total, $58 million. $58 million for this French Art Museum. And I've said publicly, I'm not against art. I love art. However, in a sort of irony, Governor McGreevey, who has indicated he wants to run for mayor of that town, has indicated he wants to kill that project because he thinks it's going to be too much of an expense after the fact. Great. Go get the $58 million, which hasn't been spent, and let's reallocate it towards schools. So the bill that I have literally line items by line items, every item in this year's budget that I would say, hey, let's take from there and let's put it towards this. And we've got to make this a priority. Most recently, I did vote for a bill, A 4161, which, I found in my time in the legislature, there are usually two parts to a bill, a good part and a not so good part. And as a good legislator, you really have to read the bill. You really have to understand it in its entirety and make the best decision you can on it. In this case, that bill gave back much needed funding, basically a cash component to these school districts that are literally suffering. I mean, just suffering by the fact that they're going to have to cut yet hundreds of more teachers and cut more programs, including I have one school district that's going to cut all sports teams if they don't get help soon. All of them, including football. So to get that cash component was very important. Of course, those that sponsored the bill also put a component in it that said that the local municipality could raise above the 2% cap. Now, the 2% property tax cap is probably the best thing the legislature has ever been able to pass. The fact that we have something that keeps our property tax at a low minimum of only 2% increase, we're the number one property taxed state in the country.
Right, and if you look historically about what got us to that point of needing the cap, it's a slippery slope to start talking about caps again. And all of a sudden, you're going to have a 7% increase again that goes all the way up to a 70%, which is what got us here in the first place.
That's right. So, of course, there's a component in this bill that says for those districts that qualify, only those school districts that qualify, they have the option to raise above the 2% cap. Now, it is only for this year. So it doesn't mean that the 2% cap is gone. It's not been broken. It's not, in perpetuity gone, right? It's this year only. And I've publicly stood on the assembly floor and encouraged my school districts not to use that component. The fact that the solution here is for those that have already paid millions in income tax, that they're not getting back to their kids in their school districts, that the solution is now they should pay more tax is absurd. It's absolutely absurd that these districts that are paying millions in and only getting a third back should now have to make up for it in property tax. So I voted yes for it because I want these districts to get the cash component because they are desperate for it. And I've publicly encouraged, and I've spoken at Board of Ed meetings to encourage that they don't use the property tax component.
Now, call me cynical, but I think we've seen this before in the it's only for a year.
Yeah.
So we're back in this cycle of temporary taxes. Does that make you nervous?
It makes me nervous. What I've said, though, is there is no doubt in my mind that both sides of the aisle recognize the S2 formula and the funding formula in general is a train wreck. It is an absolute disaster. It doesn't work, and it will get modified or replaced. I have no doubt in my mind. What I have said is we don't have a year or two to wait. These school districts are that desperate right now. When you're talking about cutting National Honor Society, the Student Council, all clubs in one district already cut. Over 250 teachers in one district already cut with another 250 lined up, with class sizes of 40 to 50 per teacher. Those are disasters. I mean, what is the point if you're operating that way? So these guys are desperate right now. They can't wait a year or two for a new formula. We need to do some short-term things. I'm hoping what we're talking about is short-term, but I am keeping my eye out on the long-term stuff.
So you talked a little bit about bipartisan collaboration earlier with your warehouse conversation. Do you see any appetite on both sides of the aisle for progress or reform on the school funding issue?
I do. And again, I have said on the floor of the Assembly, there is no doubt we are going to fix this formula going forward. No doubt. I think everybody recognizes it. Both sides have had good ideas, certainly common sense ideas that I can get on board with that others on the other side of the aisle have sponsored. I've gotten the same kind of warm reception of things that I've sponsored. So we're going to fix it. We need to do something in the short term for the guys that are really hurting right now. That's my big message to the floor.
Terrific, and I appreciate that. Love to have you back to talk more and dive more back into those ideas about how to fix school funding, because I think we could spend a whole hour on that.
Without a doubt, and I appreciate you having me, and I'd love to come back.
Absolutely. Thanks for your time today.
Sure thing.